and we've got a good crowd that's already in here. It looks like folks from both the Northwest and further afield potentially as well. So yeah.
Is it something that's open to people outside of the NWSA?
Yeah, we even let people who don't live in the Pacific Northwest come and watch this event. So
it's just bots.
Yeah. But yeah, so yeah, I'll just kind of kick off and say welcome to everyone and just say thank you for joining us tonight for this event with author Mary Roach. If you're not familiar with the Northwest Science Writers Association, we are based in the Pacific Northwest, and that the bulk of our organization is in Seattle, but we are, trying to make this organization, which is a community for science writers of all kinds, to connect to each other, to have the networking that you get and the, explore the craft with events like this. And then we also have a range of programs, writing awards, mentorship programs, things like that, which allow for career development in a variety of ways. So nwscience.org is our website, so folks can learn more about NSWA, as we call it, the Northwest Science Writers Association. But for now, I'm going to stop talking and let Hannah Weinberger, who is a fellow NSWA board member and Crosscut Science and Environment reporter, introduce our esteemed guest tonight. So Hannah, take it away.
Thank you, Ashley. I want to start off by saying, for those of us in the Seattle area, my colleagues and I within the Northwest Science Writers Association would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, who are still here. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. The Coast Salish peoples have stewarded this land long before anyone else was here, learning things that enhance our understanding of meaningful ways to coexist with wildlife, and we're in their debt. I would like to extend that gratitude to the traditional peoples and lands of our guest speaker, which include the traditional lands of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. And I am so grateful to introduce you all to Mary Roach. She's America's funniest science writer, author of acclaimed books like Grunt, Stiff, and Gulp, and the #1 professional purveyor of footnotes about going #2. Mary is the first person to tell you that she is not a scientist, and yet in her multi-decade award-speckled editorial journey through a vast number of scientific fields, from the human gut to spaceflight, she's shown us an uncanny ability to pierce the veil of wonky research with humor and render it accessible to the rest of us. That communication skill, as all of you can appreciate, has never been more important. Scientific literacy and trust are at low points, while the practices of sharing and endorsing misinformation run rampant today. Part of the problem is that science has always been presented as something beyond the every person, objective, inaccessible, too big to challenge from the outside. But communicators like Mary, with their wit, determination, and willingness to taste experimental mouse bait for the sake of a story, deeply engage readers with the absolutely bonkers ways we go about adding to our collective knowledge and show how our relationships with science matter to its application. She shows how science is theoretically pure, but in practice, wielded by fallible, emotional people who sometimes dangerously walk the line between bravery and insanity. Mary helps us appreciate, with ample doses of humor and creativity, how many risks we take to learn things, and that you don't have to be a scientist to ask good questions about how this marvelous and fragile process is being done. Before I embarrass Mary too much, let's get to the conversation. How does Mary do all of this? Mary has volunteered to chat with us about her approach to the craft and humor of science writing, in part using her recently released book, Fuzz, about the ways humans manage and penalize wildlife, and as well as some of her other works as references. So welcome, Mary.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was the best introduction I've ever had. I hope that's, you got to send that to me. I just want to over and over again when I'm having a bad day. What's that Hannah thing? I'm going to read that.
I'll send it on auto send. Awesome. So Mary, you have tackled so many topics as a journalist before you ever started writing books about science. How did the human side of science, often the grosser side, become your thing?
it kind of, well, it's started, I guess the grossness probably started with, well, stiff, I'd say, was the sort of pinnacle of gross. And that happened. It wasn't something I planned. It certainly wasn't a marketing decision. It was really just me kind of hanging out in the basement of UCSF libraries, UCSF Medical School library. In the basement was kind of where all the stuff nobody who's actually in medical school would ever want to look at, because it's all 100 years old or 70 years old, but it's really the weird stuff. And there was the STAP proceedings of the STAP car crash conference, which was the early days of automotive science. And I was like, wow, and there were, before there were crash test dummies, there were, first of all, live people riding crash sleds at certain speeds. And then over a certain speed, they're like, we better bring in the people who feel no pain. So they were using the cadavers. And so that's something I wrote about for a Salon column. And it got a lot of hits, as did the other cadaver story, which was for Thanksgiving, a piece about how much will hold before it bursts. And it was actually this German guy way back when did this cadaver study where he sort of sat a cadaver at a table and sort of filled it up, which is ridiculous because the cadaver doesn't have a vomiting reflex. So it's a terrible experiment. It was meaningless, but kind of interesting. And I just, liked the image of the dead guy at the table. So both those columns got high hits, and this agent said, you ought to think about maybe writing a book about cadavers. And I thought that's a terrible idea. Who would buy that book or read that book? But I did a proposal and it sold. And so I was off and running as the gross person, the bottom feeder of science writing.
Right. And you've, embraced that kind of persona. Is it something that's attractive to you now, writing about gross science as a communicator? Like, what makes it such a ripe thing to delve into?
It is, it's appealing to me for a couple of reasons. One is that no one else wants to go there, or nobody else wants to wear that hat. Whereas I'm like, I'll be the person who writes 3 chapters about flatus, because when you get down to it, it's like, you got to do one about how the early studies were done, because don't even get me started on that. And then I had another one about hydrogen sulfide. And then there was one about, what was the third flatus chapter? Anyway, I don't care that people are like, wow, she wrote 3 chapters on farts. I don't care what people think, because it's really fun to report, because it's the combination of sober and pedigreed scientists studying these things that we think of as sort of tee-hee kind of children's things. And in fact, flatus is important. We don't, again, don't get me started. but so it's something that I don't have a lot of competition in that realm. So I have a kind of my own little corner to myself to play in. And it's just, it does appeal to me because of what I was saying, because of sort of the weirdness of, the being, the people that do this work have to kind of keep a straight face and talk about what they do. And then they sort of win you over with their enthusiasm and passion for these odd little things that they study. So I'm very fond of those researchers and the work that they do. And like the Italian saliva lady in Gulp was one of my favorite. This woman who's passionate about spit, but she's this beautiful, well-dressed Italian woman. She's not what you think of when you think of a woman who's devoted her career to saliva. Anyway, I love these folks. So it does appeal to me. Yeah.
Absolutely. And while we're on the topic, you found so many things humorous about science. Does the institution of science lend itself towards humor in ways that other things you've written about don't?
No, not really. It's actually hard for me to find topics, because I think most of science, especially now everything has gone to the level of, genomes and protein receptors, and it's happening kind of invisibly and on computers And in scanning electron microscopes, it's not something that you can kind of see and throw yourself into. So it is definitely, I'm definitely cherry picking certain things that enable me to do the things that I like to do, for sure. Like if I had to write a book about particle physics or a straight up genetics book, I think it would be tough for me to do it in the way that I like to do things. There might be a way. It's all in the narratives that you choose and the people that you find. Really, it comes down to people and stories. So there probably is a way, but some things just lend themselves to that. So
exactly, you'd only get 2 chapters about flatus out of particle physics somehow. So, speaking of the things that attract you to books, I gather that Fuzz germinated from a curiosity about tiger penises. Like, when does the seed of an idea get an upgrade to a book? Like, to merit the years of your time?
Yeah. The tiger penises were a dead end. And this happens frequently with me when I'm looking around for a book idea. I rarely start with an idea. I start with a couple of chunks of something that I find kind of tasty and interesting. Like in this case, I stumbled onto both a paper and a guide for wildlife enforcement officers, and it's entitled how to distinguish real versus counterfeit tiger penis, and it's 8 pages long, and it's kind of an interesting. Again, we don't have to go on a whole sidebar about that. I can tell you, I'm pretty good at distinguishing real versus fake tiger penis at a glance. But anyway,
take your word for it.
The woman who wrote it, Bonnie Yates, she works up at the National Wildlife Forensics Lab in Ashland, Oregon, and I was like, oh, I don't know, wildlife and forensics, that's kind of 2 things that are interesting to me. It turns out she also put together a hair library, and just that right there, hair library, it was one of those that kind of spoke to me. So I just went up to see her. I went up to visit her thinking, I don't know what this book might be, but let me go check it out. And it's not that far. It's just, a day's travel up to to Oregon. And she was interesting and really amazing. And there were a lot of interesting stories, but it was a dead end because any open case that's being investigated, legally I can't tag along. I can't be on the scene, and that is a no-go for me. So, right. But then then some other dead end side trips. I stumbled onto that book from 1906, The Criminal Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals, and that was an astounding, bizarre book. And so at that point, I started thinking, what if you turn it around and the wildlife are the perpetrators and the humans are the victims, rather than, up in Ashland, the animals are the victims. So it was this roundabout, messy, evolving process that kind of gelled when I found that book. And I thought of like, oh, I could do it crime by crime, crime. They're not really.
Oh, yeah, we've learned. Exactly.
So that's kind of how it came about. I never have a tidy origin story. I wish I was like, well, as a child, I was harassed by wolverines, or I don't have any. I never have that. It's rarely a moment of inspiration. It's kind of groping and running into walls, and then finally just sitting down on something and going, okay, this kind of fits. Let's see how this goes.
Exactly. So you don't go into this saying, I want to interrogate power dynamics and ethics and wildlife management and show how the idea of a pest is subjective. It's like, let's see if they...
No, not at all. No.
Exactly. But you are, the first person to note like how much you are willing to do to get those pieces, parts, and get them into something that looks like a book. Like, what are some experiences you've had reporting that really illustrate the lengths you'll go to get a scene or a fact? Like, how much work is this?
It is. because I think, people ask me about, well, why do you think your books are successful? And they think that I'm going to say something about writing. And it's got nothing to do with writing, really. I mean, the writing is important, but the writing can only be good if the research happened in a way that gave me good material. So I spend a lot of time looking around for a scene, a character, a setting. When I wrote Spook, Spook is about people trying to use scientific method to prove or disprove that there's an afterlife or a soul. So a bunch of it is historical. And I had a chapter on ectoplasm, which a lot of it would be historical because it was the spiritualists who were really big on that. And I tried, there are some spiritualist groups that do claim to use ectoplasm, and they wisely ignored all of my overtures to them. But then I found that the archives at Cambridge University in England, I think it was Cambridge or Oxford, but that they had an alleged ectoplasm sample in a box. So I flew all the way to the manuscripts room at Cambridge, which you need to apply to get into in order just to see this object in a box. And it was worth it, even though the moment was maybe it was like 5 minutes of my time when the page, because they have these ivory skinned young pages that go and fetch it and bring it to you. And so I opened it up, and the card described it as faintly smelling. And it had been vaginally secreted. It had been, because the ectoplasm, it's a cloth. It's kind of like in this case, it wasn't cheesecloth, but ectoplasm is, it was this fake kind of in the dark. They pull it out, and they had to hide it first. Anyway, it had been allegedly up someone's vagina. And so I'm in the manuscripts room where people are studying, like Darwin's seed stock and, medieval land transfers. And I'm like, whoa, like looking at this alleged ectoplasm. Anyway, so that was a long flight for 5 minutes in an archive, but I had a sense that it would be worth it. There was a chapter in Grunt where, had to do with diarrhea, which killed historically far more soldiers than bombs and bullets. Dysentery, and before there was refrigeration, the food would sit out and the flies would go from the latrine to the mess tent, which was not screened, was not fly proof. So there were massive deaths from diarrhea. And then I wanted to talk about how now it's just special operations, the guys who go in and kill Osama bin Laden or whatever they're up to. They get hit a lot because they're living on the land in these small villages. And so I went all the way to Djibouti, Camp Lemonade in Djibouti, Africa, because there was a researcher there who was doing a trial of a better anti-diarrheal drug. And also there were special operations people because it's right near Yemen and a bunch of terrorist hotspots. So I had to get access through the military, which meant saying, well, I'm writing about diarrhea. And these people in the public affairs office were kind of like, oh, okay, I don't even know where to start to get permission for this. So it went like up the chain of command and back down. Finally, it's the public affairs guy on the ground in Djibouti. He's just like, I don't even know whose swim lane this is, but this woman's not going to go away. This is what he told me after I got there. This woman's not going to go away. So can we just let her come? And the guy on base goes, yeah, I don't care. So off I went to Djibouti. And really, all I really wanted was to sit down with a special operations person, dude, and get him to talk about essentially when he was hit by really bad diarrhea during a mission. And of course, the mission was classified, so he couldn't really, at one point he just said, and I had to accost him in the dining facility because that's the only time that special operations people come out of their special top secret security area. So I had to sit down with this guy at with his tray, his meal tray, and explain very quickly that I'm writing about diarrhea and da 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 da. And can he tell me about a time when he's dealt with that? And he actually was pretty forthcoming. And although he kept saying, "Who are you with?" No, really, who are you with? So anyway, that was a long flight. That was a long way to go. But really, for me, one of the most entertaining scenes, because I was very nervous. These guys are very intimidating and they don't want to talk to you. You know, they spend all their time off on their own in their own secure. I think that the wall, you know, there's like barbed wire everywhere. And I think it actually says basically you'll be shot. We have permission to shoot you if you try to come in here.
So what were your conversations with your editor like at this point where you're saying you need a diarrhea scene where you might get shot? Like, where do they have a say in this process?
Oh, my editor never has any idea what I'm going to do. When I write my book proposals, at least 70% of it I don't end up doing because I find better things. So I hadn't found the guy, the researcher at that point. So Jill, my editor, she had no idea. She never knows what I'm doing. And she kind of agrees to these books, kind of going, "What? You want to do what?" So no, she had no idea.
So, you know, on the flip side of best practices being just get the interview, it'll happen if you stand there long enough. Like sometimes the access doesn't come, but you still manage to pivot and make lemonade out of lemons. You know, how did those situations end up being fruitful?
Well, this way, there was a chapter I wanted to write in Packing from Mars that had to do with a cadaver test. Because Stiff was popular, I like to throw a cadaver in when I can in my books. And I heard of they were doing it was a capsule splashdown test. So if the capsule comes down and the waves are high and the capsule hits in a way it's not supposed to, they wanted to be sure that, if it hits sideways, that the hard parts of the astronaut's suit wouldn't impact the arm and break the arm. So they needed to do a cadaver test. There was no crash test dummy that would work for a capsule splashdown. So they had to use a cadaver. And I was like, oh, excuse me, I need to be there for that because my readers will enjoy this. And NASA was just, the public affairs woman was just very squirrely. She's like, well, the Constellation people don't want you to do it. I'm like, no, I spoke to them. They're on board. She goes, no, well, it's the Ohio State that's crash led people. They're very uncomfortable. I'm like, no, I know, Ralph, we're good. And so she finally goes, Mary, it's not any one thing. It's just everything. The answer is no. And so Ralph at OSU, I think his name was Ralph. He's like, Mary, just show up. I'm like, okay. So I did. I showed up. And I knew that there was a chance that I might get turned away. But once you're there, it becomes a scene unto itself. Like I walked in and the two people from NASA were there and they were like, oh, who are you? I introduced myself and they said, Mary Roach. And they literally ran down the stairs, past the cadaver, told the graduate students, don't speak to her. They were wiring up the cadaver. They ran in and they called this public affairs woman. And she said, Mary Roach is there? And she said, oh, just talk to her. Because I think that she realized that this is going to be a scene either way. She's no dummy. So either they can, I'm going to be reporting about this test, even if I'm having to watch it from a distance and have the students not speak to me. In a way, it would almost have been funnier to do it that way. So sometimes just being on the scene, first of all, it's harder to say no to someone in person. And also, at the very least, they owe you a conversation. So I did this, the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency also at the last minute said, oh, I know we said that you could sit in and watch. There was an astronaut. They were choosing new astronauts and they were doing a psych test where they would be given challenges and they'd be observed by psychologists. And they said that I could be there. And then about 3 days beforehand, the woman said, oh, I'm so sorry, you can't. And I said, well, I have a non-refundable ticket, so I'm going to come. And I'm hoping you can set up a meeting where we can talk about this, and maybe there's a way to make whoever it is feel more comfortable. So I was prepared to just sit in my hotel in Scuba Science City, regularly emailing the PR woman and making her feel sorry for me. And it worked out. They relented. So persistence is a big part of this game, I think. That's a last resort to show up. I mean, that's obnoxious. It is.
Every PR person in our orbit is like feeling a tremor in the force right now. Like they don't know why they're scared, but something's happening.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it is obnoxious. But I mean, I just felt that there was, in both those cases, there was no real reason. The cadaver test that NASA was doing, they were using a cadaver that had been donated willfully. They were doing something that was making the astronauts safer. It was a good use of a cadaver. There was no reason for her to be all squirrely. So, that's what she gets.
So, when you do get access, you're riding somebody's coattails through their work, you observe people and activities in such a uniquely curious and creative way that really sings on the page. What is your mindset like in the field? Do you go in looking for things or waiting to take notes? Like what is Mary out in her element like?
I'm a big believer in going in and without really knowing without knowing what the chapter's about, because I don't. You can do your homework and you can look up papers and you can have a preliminary conversation, but until you're there and I always try to stay a couple of days, because the longer you stay, the more people feel at ease with you, and there's just more opportunities for things to happen. There's the more time you spend. I mean, sometimes it's only an afternoon, but I feel like, if I don't have a list of questions written out that I'm going to ask, because I do feel like I want whoever this person is, I want them to lead me to the best questions, because if you show up and you steer the interview toward what you think you want to know, you may miss the most interesting things because you know nothing of this person's work and the things that are important or funny. You just don't know. So you just sort of absorb it all. And if you need details and facts later, you can always email or call. So the main thing is just to for me, the main concern is to get some conversations that happen in a context that's interesting, so there is a narrative. So I'm there, I'm trying to find a scene or a narrative, and that's that you can't really plan for. I mean, you can feel like, okay, I'm going to go, and you're gathering data, or you're doing this, so you can, but you just you don't really know how it's going to go, and you can't. I don't ever worry about sounding like an idiot, asking simple questions, being confused. I don't mind any of that, and people are incredibly generous and good natured. I kind of treat my sources as unpaid tutors. I'm just there was one I was trying to understand for Packing for Mars. There was a chapter about escaping from submarines that have gone down fairly deep, not terribly deep, but at a depth from which you could actually escape. And I wanted to understand the bends, and I was having a difficulty understanding, why does the gas come out of solution? Why does it, what's going on? And this one researcher could not bring it down to my level. So I just sort of walked away from him and asked someone else who had wonderfully just said, a soda stream. It's like a soda stream. You're putting pressure, it's going, it's going into the water. And then when you let the pressure up, they form bubbles, and that's what's happening. And I was like, oh, soda stream, thank you. So you sometimes you just have to pivot and find somebody who can speak to you on your level. And for me, that's like 7th grade.
You put a lot of scenes like this in your work. And something that's always really attracted me to the way you write is that you use yourself as a character in a really effective way. Like, how do you decide when to put yourself in a scene?
I think that I think of myself as kind of I'm kind of a proxy for the reader. Like I'm discovering these things as I go along. I'm coming in at the same level as the reader, really. So it's a way for me to say kind of like, this is all new to me too, and it's confusing, and like we're going to figure it out together. So in that sense, it's an advantage to not have a background in science. In other ways, it's definitely a disadvantage, but in that way, it is an advantage. And so my being present in the scene is kind of like taking the reader by the hand and going, come with me. This is weird or confusing or whatever it is, but we're going to go through it together and it'll be fun. So, but there are, definitely places where I don't need to be. My editor used to I'd go like, so I called da-da-da. She's like, we don't care that you called somebody. Just like, take that out. You don't, that kind of gratuitous first person. So she is a good, effective police of that. If you're going to use first person, you have to earn your keep there in the book. You're either advancing the narrative or you're serving some function. With humor, if somebody's going to be laughed at, I want it to be me. So I'm sometimes the clueless outsider. That was definitely true for Grunt. Because I don't know. I've never deployed in the military. I don't know anybody in the military, and I wanted that to be clear to the reader that I am definitely an outsider, and so I don't mind poking fun at myself. It's that's a kind of humor that's not doesn't offend anybody. So that's another reason.
Right. It's very relatable and kind of drives home in a lot of places how difficult the work is that some of the people you're interviewing do. You're not having that background allows you to stay curious and not assume things. I think,
Right.
If we're going to talk about some moments from this book, that scene where you're at the WART training and you feel like you finally understand what's going on with analyzing these fake bodies. And it turns out that the thing you pointed out was an injection mark.
Oh, the injection molding.
Yeah, exactly. It's very effective. So, on the topic of humor, I want to make sure we leave time for that. What is it like trying to distill some of these complex science topics down into things that are not only relatable and accessible and funny, but not so reductive as to be glib, especially when we're talking about death?
Right. Wait, what's the question?
How do you walk that line of really adding enough science into something without losing the humor or not adding in too much humor to lose the science?
Right. Well, I think that it's really important to be consistent with your tone. Every now and then I'll see there's a story in the New Yorker that I'm thinking of that was an amazing piece about, I forget who the writer was, but he's describing driving in a car with his child and he hit black ice and the car spinning around and around and time slowing down. And it was partly about time slowing down and partly about that experience. And it was beautifully written. But then he got to the part where he wanted to explain the physics of black ice. And he obviously talked to some physicist who he just kind of put quotes around what the physicist said, which is just one of those things. I've done that. And then, my editor's like, no, try again. Or you're just like, I don't really get this, so I'll just let the researcher say it. But then, it's like this clunk. It's like trying to shift a car while you're still, without the clutch in. It's just, it's very jarring. It doesn't help the reader, so you have to go back and explain that you don't have a background in physics. And can you help me with maybe an image, or I'm so sorry, but I don't know what you're talking about. So because you know that if you're going to be funny, you've got to be a little bit funny with your explanations too. You know, you can't just get really dry and flat if your tone has been kind of freewheeling all along. You can't lurch into. So you've got to, or I have to. I should say you. I have to be careful, and I try to. You know, there's in Fuzz, there's a scene where I'm trying to explain or understand gene drives, and initially just the genetic modification part of it before the gene drive part. And I was like, how do you get that in there? You know, how do you, and it's just me being kind of petulant and impatient, and the researchers trying to explain to me what's going on. And I just include myself in there as, you know, to kind of break it up and not make it too heavy, and to keep the tone light. So in that sense, using, you know, my presence and my confusion as a tool. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, thank you for that work, because I finally understand CRISPR now that you've described it as, you know, scissors and barcode readers and dollhouse drug paraphernalia. So it works. You know, you do talk with people about complex things that are really heavy sometimes, and you still get them to joke around. How would you describe your bedside manner as a reporter when you're running the gamut of light to heavy topics?
There's one instance in Packing for Mars that where things shifted, and I had to kind of pivot in the moment, because the whole interview became something else. I was up on Devon Island, which is an analog for Mars and the Moon, and they do a lot of rover tests and suit tests and things like that. And so I was talking to a guy, John Clark, who designs suits. He's a suit guy. And I was like, you know, I just sort of, this wasn't going to be in the book. It was just, well, he's here and I can get some background information. So we were just sitting and talking about suits. And he talked about how he wanted to design an escape suit, a survival suit for altitude, for like if the craft starts to break up at, and depending on what altitude you're at, that's a very different, you know, if there's not enough air, you're going to like be spinning around and die that way. If there's too much friction, you're going to burn up. So the suit has to do, you need to shoot, but there has to be enough air for the shoot. And so it was this whole complicated conversation. But at one point I looked, he had given me a mission patch, and I was just looking at the names, and one of the names was Clark. And I realized that his wife had been on, I think it was Columbia, and had been killed. And so that's why he was so passionate about making a suit to survive a breakup on coming down or going up. And so suddenly it was just, this is going to be a scene, because it was really poignant, and I had to decide how much do I ask him about this and what's appropriate, because he didn't say it, he just sort of gave me that patch. So you have to be kind of sort of go with the moment, and you just, you know, I want people to always feel comfortable, and I want them to enjoy it. So I don't know what my bedside manner is. I like it to be fun, because fun is more fun for the reader too. But sometimes somebody being like, there's a guy in Spook. One of my favorite chapters in Spook was a guy, it has to do with soul weighing, which was done, you know, there was a guy, Duncan McDougall, 1907, tried to weigh people as they die to see if the scale would go down a little bit. Really not a very great experimental method. But anyway, there's a guy at Duke University who wanted to do kind of a quantum mechanics theory of consciousness version of that, and to have an enclosed space with all these different electromagnetic sensors, and he's, you know, he's a consciousness theory guy, and so he's speaking in this I have no idea what he's talking about, and my struggle to understand him, you know, because he'd be like, I think, you know, he'd say things like, something about microtubules and the nanoparticles of what, this crazy thing. But he would preface it by, as I'm sure you're aware. But that conversation between him and myself, his being just so up in the ether, and to the point where I don't know if he's brilliant or nuts. And I'm trying to kind of figure that out and also understand this stuff that he's talking about. That interplay makes that chapter kind of hilarious. I love that chapter. He was a really good sport about it. He actually liked the chapter, which was, I expected a very long email explaining how I'd gotten everything wrong. But what I'm saying is that humor, the person doesn't have to be funny. I don't have to be funny. The humor often just comes from circumstances and the bizarre, surreal things that happen in science. And, you just know it when you see it, I guess.
So, if you have a good enough rapport with your source, when you have that, science translation conversation where you show them how their jargon is euphemism for like, your job is so weird, it's like you can both laugh about it at that point.
Right.
Going back to the Columbia incident, how do you manage your own emotions while learning hard things on the job? And, how does that add to what you're able to produce?
I guess one of the places that was toughest or one of the most emotional parts that was Grunt, because I spoke to this young man who had stepped on an IED and had lost part of both legs, had some damage to his penis, it was being repaired. Not serious, just his urethra, they had to rebuild it. But he told me that, and I saw him after he had the operation. I actually saw the operation. And then I just asked him to tell me the story. And he told me the story, and it was just like heart-wrenching, just very emotional. And I still get choked up when I tell that story sometimes. But I feel like that speaks to some truth that is necessary to the narrative of the military and what men and women go through. So I value those moments. I don't know how I handle them. I just am there, and afterwards I'm kind of like processing it, and I think later I cry about it. But I feel like they're kind of a gift because they're real, and I think that you don't want to run away from the emotional content of your material when there is in fact some emotional content. And that, the book, the first chapter that I reported for Grunt was at the morgue at Dover. That's the first place that I went, and I had a sense that this would end the book, that this would probably be at the conclusion of the book. Because there was a lot of honesty and emotion expressed by the people who, anybody who dies overseas, they come back and they're given an autopsy with their protective gear in place, so that they can see if, how well did it work? Is there anything we could have done better? But just talking to those guys, holy shit. Because they get, there were times when there'd be 7 autopsy tables going at once. In the peak of the Iraq War. So you have to be true to it. And I think that it makes the book better. I think, I'm having the most fun when it's light or funny or goofy or surreal or surprising or gross. That's fun for me, but it's always better to have some depth or emotion to a book. You never know where it's going to show up, but you can't really shy away from it. I think.
Right. So the humor can't come, at the cost of lacking empathy. It should at least inform it.
Yeah, there's nothing funny about that scene.
Right.
Or the Dover chapter. I don't know if there was anything funny in that chapter. Like, maybe, I tend to wander often get sidetracked. And there may have been something in that chapter or a footnote or something. But I don't remember anything. It's like when I wrote Stiff, there was a chapter about airplane crashes and how the bodies of, especially if it goes down over water, so it's not just a smoking hole, the bodies often are fairly intact and they can be used forensically if you don't have a black box to understand what happened in flight. And I left that out of the book, and my editor said, well, hey, you said you were going to write this chapter about plane crashes and the forensics of the victims. And I said, well, the tone doesn't really, there's nothing funny there. And she said, well, I think you should try it anyway, which was good advice. So, it's not a rollicking chapter.
Right. I am glad that you were able to deal with your emotions in order to let it inform your work. And for readers, going through those heavy things with you, that you have footnotes that kind of add a little bit of comic relief.
Sure. Yeah.
I want to make sure that we leave time for our audience questions, and I stop hogging all of your time. But, on the topic of handling the work, NSWA is a writer community. A lot of us really rely on each other for getting through some of those hard moments. What is your writing community like?
Well, I write at an office. There are, it's a funny old building downtown that has, everybody has their own little office with a door and a window, but we share a kitchen and a common area. And so it's mostly just social and a place where there's always someone you can bitch to if you're needing that. And people there, some people are writing books, some are science writers working on, there's Amy Maxman, who writes for Nature, is there. Kat McGowan, who writes for any number of publications. Gordy Slack, another science writer, and Molly Bentley, who does big picture science, is there. Doug Berman, who's Wait, Don't Tell Me, the producer of that. So, and then some documentary filmmakers, podcasters, local radio station. So we are this collection of kind of quirky people, but they're great people and they're really fun. And that is wonderful for my sanity, because I used to work alone out of an office, out of my home years ago. And that's not good for me.
Man. Well, I wonder how you all get anything done with access to so many fun people all the time, but it's wonderful that you have that resource.
Yeah, it's great. I recommend it. And all it is just, you go out and you look at some commercial space, and they actually built it out for us, put what little, made bigger spaces into smaller ones. So it's something anyone can do, and we each have our own lease with the landlord. So I encourage people to set up. There's about 20 something of us there. I mean, since COVID, it's been a little bit empty, but people are starting to come back. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Mary. We are going to move into the more exciting section of the evening, which is where everyone else has questions.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start with one from James Gaines. What are you reading lately?
What am I reading? Right now, I'm reading On Animals by Susan Orlean, who's one of my favorite nonfiction writers, and because we're doing an event next week together. So I'm often reading something for an event that I'm doing, or if I'm blurbing something. I just recently, well, I guess it's been a couple of months now, but Nicola Twilley, who writes for the New Yorker, wrote a book called Until Proven Safe, on the history and future of quarantine, which sounds, having lived through quarantine, it's, you're like, oh my God, that sounds boring. It's so interesting though. It's a fascinating book. I mean, I could go on and on about it, but I won't. But that was really interesting. I just read Dave Eggers' The Every, which imagines a future in which Amazon and Google merge, which is both a horrifying dystopian future, but also you're reading along and you go, we're kind of halfway there right now. So it's sort of funny but chilling. And next up, I have John Mooallem's collection of pieces, which I'm looking forward to. He's also one of my favorite nonfiction writers.
Excellent. We have a question from Sally James. how would you teach other people to be patient and grope and find their way to a theme in the way that works for you? Have you taught any writing workshops?
I've often taught, like I'll go and sit in on a class for a day, like Michael Pollan here at the J School. I'll go and talk to his students for an afternoon, but I don't think I don't have that much to say to fill a whole class. I'm also, because of I do a lot of travel, it's tough for me to be there for a whole course worth of time. But the question was, how do I teach people the patience? Was that what it was?
Yes, yeah, to not let yourself get ahead of the idea and to let it come to you and tell you it's
yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's something that is easier with a book where you have the luxury of time. It is like, I remember hearing Burkhard Bilger, is one of my favorite New Yorker writers, talk about, he wanted to write about raw cheese and people making raw cheese. It was called, the raw milk underground, or the raw cheese underground. And he spent a crazy amount of time trying to find the person that he would focus on. He went somewhere, he went to this farm, drove there, and he described backing out of the driveway and thinking, I don't have it. And going back to the drawing board, finally finding these nuns who were clandestinely in the basement making illegal cheese. So the combination of like illegal activities and nuns, turned this into a really appealing and intriguing story, which could otherwise have just been, I don't know, raw milk cheese. Is it good or bad for you? Should it be illegal? Who's doing it? It could have been really flat, but just, the nuns, he found the nuns. But the amount of time that and I remember just feeling like it's okay to spend that much time getting it right. Because if you don't get it right, the writing, nothing proceeds as it should. So you put the time in up front and then everything kind of flows. So it's just, it's not easy, especially with a deadline and you're trying to pay the rent and all that. I've been there. I've reported stories where I didn't have it right. And the stories were, they were And I guess I hate having an story. So I'm more motivated just to get it right. And also to sometimes just know when to cut your losses and back off. Sometimes it's not there, and there's nothing worse than trying to write it and report it when it's just not happening. So that's also important to know, when to realize it's not a story.
Right. Not just because of the artistic value, but because of the business value.
Right.
We have a lot of recognition for the cheese nuns in the chat. So that story landed for sure.
Oh, every Burkhard Bilger story lands. Oh my God. Remember the one about the footwear of Ötzi, the Iceman, the guy who studied footwear, and he walked around, he made a pair of shoes out of the materials, like, I don't know, straw or whatever, and he walked around in those. That guy was fantastic. Anyway, it's another classic Burkhard Bilger story.
It sounds like he's, one of your influences. And we actually have a question from someone, Robin Lindley, about, your origin stories. So what was your training as a writer? Like, did you want to be a writer as a child?
No, I didn't. I didn't have any sense of wanting to be a writer. In fact, when I got through college as an undergraduate, I knew that I didn't want to go to grad school because I did not ever want to write another paper. I was like, I'm done writing papers. Yay. So no, I had no intention of becoming a writer. I started out doing copy editing, and that's a bad fit for me because I'm not the kind of person, I'm not detail oriented. I don't care if something's capitalized differently in chapter 2 versus chapter 18. I'm like, I know he's going to notice. You can't think that way as a copy editor. So I wasn't a very good copy editor. And I thought, it'd be easier to write this stuff than to clean it up. So maybe I'll try writing. So I didn't have any dreams of being a writer or any training. I took a copywriting class once, and that was kind of it. I tried to take one writing class at Wesleyan. Annie Dillard had seminar. You had to submit something to get in. I didn't get in. So I don't have a background in writing, really. Just kind
How
of.
did you hone your sense of humor or your comedic voice? Is that something that's been intentional?
I think it was kind of there from the start. I mean, I look back not that long ago at some of the first pieces I wrote for Image magazine, which was the Sunday magazine of the San Francisco Examiner. And the tone is pretty much me. I think it's just how I have fun as a writer. It's always been that way. Some stories lend themselves more to humor than others. There's definitely stories I wrote that don't have really any humor in them because there wasn't anything to play with.
Right. Just so you know, in the chat, we have a quote that just says, "Annie is sorry now." So put that in your hat.
Yeah.
And, on the topic of, how you developed and found your niche, Maria Ruth has a question where she says, though you are wildly successful in your fabulous Mary Roach niche, do you ever feel you're in a pigeonhole and would love to break out into another genre?
Not fiction. I know I could never make up characters. And also I like finding these people and meeting them and spending time with them. I don't want to create them. And I read fiction and I'm just so blown away by it. And I know that's beyond my grasp. So that's fine. Don't want to do that. I do sometimes think that it would be fun to do the kind of book that follows just like a book length rabbit hole where you kind of follow a path that takes surprising turns and is a beginning, middle, end type of book. I would love to do that, but I have a different set of goggles and I don't find those ideas. I would love for somebody to say, I found this mysterious thing in my attic, or for me to find something mysterious in my attic and to trace that mystery through time and all that kind of book appeals to me, but I've just never stumbled on to anything like that.
If you had to go back to any of the people that you've brought into your orbit as sources through the history of your books as, the central character in a book like that, who do you think would be the most fruitful person to go back to?
That's a great question. It's hard to say. There's so many books. I'm now all of the.
We can let that simmer and go on to a question from.
Let that one simmer because I don't know that there is someone there. They all were like perfect for a chapter, and I nobody jumps out as like I would spend a whole book with them, but that's because there's too many of them, and I'm not. I guess it would also depend on what they were about to undertake. I think if somebody came to me and said, like if Jerry Nahum, the guy from Duke University who wanted to, put a leech in a box and have it die and measure everything, he actually went to the Catholic Church to try to get funding. Like if the Catholic Church had said yes, and he actually did it. And I mean, that sounded kind of appealing and bizarre. But I don't want to spend a whole book with Jerry Nahum. No,
we won't let him watch this.
Yeah.
So Sally James,
he's a lovely man. What? Yeah.
What was that?
I said he's a lovely man.
Talking about your preferences for chapter by chapter, finding sources that fit. Sally James has a question that I'm really glad they asked. I have this question too. What is the ratio of chapters researched versus chapters that make it into a book? You talked about cutting your losses, and how many losses versus final chapters?
Oh, you should see the back of my file cabinet. There's at least 10 folders back there. They're in the front for a while because I think I'm going to do them at a certain point. They get put in the back because the just didn't work out. I wanted to do an egg addling chapter, the Canada geese. I wanted to become an egg addler for various reasons. But it didn't work out because it's tricky. You have to do it at the right time, or they lay another clutch. And then also, anyway, there's lots of reasons why it didn't work out. But so that's in the back. I had there's at least, okay. So if there's 10 chapters that didn't make it in, and there's 15 in the book. So it's, you do the math.
So Mary, what is egg addling a euphemism for?
Oh, goose abortion. Basically,
there we go.
It's an egg that, and they did a lot of work to figure out how to tell how far along. So it's got to be very early on. As with abortion in humans, you want it to be done as early as possible. So if the egg floats, it means there's more air than goose in the egg, and so at that point you can either cover it in oil, which suffocates it, or shake it when it's very, very tiny. But it's basically goose abortion. So I would have, been a goose abortionist.
I mean, I feel like there are a lot of people who would be receptive to that. And in fact, we have people in the chat now saying they would come back for an evening where we just talk about the things that didn't make it into your books. So
I would like to, because I'm so tired of talking about the stuff that's in the book. I'm like, please, let's talk about egg addling.
And then, with the last question that I'll keep you around for, unless you have other people who want your time.
No,
why would you want to abort a goose?
What?
It's, from Jenny Morber. Why would you want to abort a goose?
Well, there are a lot of municipalities that have an overpopulation of Canada geese, and the Canada goose produces a fair amount of crap. And so parks, people complain because the parks are covered in, we have at Lake Merritt here in Oakland, whole sections that no one goes on but the geese. Although we let them, there's nothing that is done here with the Canada geese, but golf course people, playing fields, soccer fields, places like that. And the geese, the resident populations are expanding. There's the migratory ones, and then there's residents, and a lot of geese are finding that there's enough food for them to hang around year round. So that becomes a problem for municipalities, and they would like to lower the population. So hence the egg addling efforts. As opposed to killing. So.
Right. Well, we haven't been blessed with the full piece on egg addling yet. I'm glad you were able to get in a lengthy footnote about goose poop as a hazard that mentioned it briefly. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Smear campaign.
Oh no, Mary, is that a pun? Okay. So thank you so much for giving us your time tonight. We have hundreds of other questions that we would love to keep you around for. So we'll have to see if we can twist your arm to get you back here sometime. I really am grateful to you for giving us your time. Everyone who's hung around to this point, good on you. You know where to spend your Wednesday evenings. I want to make sure that you know that NSWA is hosting online science trivia next Thursday, the 28th at 6 p.m. And there are some links that we can send you if you want to flex your funny bone and your trivia knowledge. We also have some Best of the Northwest writing awards that are open right now through November 15th. So you might not be Mary, but you can still have everybody read and tell you how great your work is. In that capacity, we would love to boost your ego. Mary, thank you. What are you going to be spending your time doing for your next project? Are you even thinking about the next book yet?
Oh, I have a proposal written that is my agent has read, but my editor has not read. So I'm hoping that that's what I'll be doing, but I'm not really talking about it yet. But it is a nonfiction book, and I'm excited to be heading back out into the world. It's been a long time. So
exactly. You may do with the Zoom interviews in parts of Fuzz, but I know we are all excited to know what that book is about, and maybe we'll hear about it before your editor. It seems like that's the thing. So thank you so much, Mary.
Oh, you're so welcome. And thanks everybody for tuning in and listening. It's something I love to talk about. And thank you, Hannah, for being such a great interviewer and such an engaging person. And yeah, it was really fun. So, and good luck to everybody with your science writing career. It's a wonderful career. And I wish you the best with it.
Great. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.